I really am honored to be here this morning, to be invited to speak with what I consider to be a very distinguished group of people here this morning, and to share with you a few thoughts about our special state and its forest heritage. As some of you may or may not know, I was born up here in Thompson Falls, not far from here, and raised in Libby, about 200 miles north, deep in the heart of the Kootenai National Forest. And my grandfather was a logging camp cook, and he came to Montana, like many of the ancestors of all of us, to make his career and his family in this special state that all of us know was made for dreams. How could anyone not come to this special place of 148,000 square miles of God's earth and look out on Montana's natural and very immense wonders, the high plains, the mountains, the forests, the pure waters, and not dream? You simply cannot avoid dreaming in a vast place as wondrous as Montana. My grandfather made the best donuts in the world. He'd make them for us sometimes when he'd come out of the woods for a while. But more importantly, he made us aware of the woods. People in Lincoln County, my relatives and many of my classmates, went into the woods for their work life, just like New England fishermen go down to the sea for their work life. The woods, like the oceans, are vast, as you know, overpowering places with dangers and beauties and special rules of survival that people take years to learn. And in some cases, those who entered those wild domains did not return alive. Many communities like Libby have grown up around and thrived on the wood products industry. Missoula, Bozeman, Dillon, Columbia Falls, and many others have all benefited greatly. The industry remains in some communities. In others, it has become a memory, like the two-man saw. Even with its constant economic significance, the timber industry has always had boom and bust cycles. Even its yearly schedule was like that, which I suspect is why you hold your conference over spring breakup. Today, it is much smaller than even just a few years ago. By 1991, wood products industry employment had fallen to 10,130. Though we've had a slight increase since then, we may be in another severe employment decline in that industry, as you know. Similarly, the sales of wood products have declined in Montana in the 1990s, from just over $1 billion in 1989 to $950 million in 1991. And we continue to see western Montana sawmills close. With the shortage of timber comes increased raw material prices, higher lumber prices at the yard, increased housing costs, and even higher insurance costs. More change from the old days. You just take care of the woods, everybody said, and the woods will take care of you. Midwestern farmers told their children the same thing, as did our ranchers out east. And I suspect the automobile assembly line workers in Detroit told their youngsters much the same. Well, things have changed in recent times, and changed drastically, as no one knows better than people who work in and manage our forests. Thousands of automobile workers no longer work on the assembly lines. Thousands of farm families no longer live and work on their ancestral lands. Thousands of miners no longer toil beneath the ground. And thousands of forestry workers no longer work in the woods and the mills. My grandfather became an early displaced wood products worker too. You see, when the big trucks came into the woods with the new roads, the old railroads and isolated logging camps were no longer necessary. The men didn't need to stay in the woods for weeks and months at a time anymore. And that meant they didn't need logging camp cooks. I probably don't have to tell you, he despised logging trucks until the day he died. Displacement has created a difficult time for our society and a kind of chronic unease among many people. More than 137,000 Montanans were forced to leave their home state between 1985 and 1990 as these changes rippled through their lives. The kind of change that struck again last spring at Troy, where the Racicot mine is located, and then last fall at the mills in Bonner and Libby, and most recently in Superior. Besides death and taxes, one other thing that has become inevitable in our lives, and that is change. Nothing stays the same for very long anymore. I can remember when a Saturday Night Special was not a cheap, deadly handgun. It was a double banana split. It can be worrisome, stressful, and disconcerting to experience change unless perhaps you're a butterfly, or as my spouse has told me, a wet baby, or unless we change the way we think about change. You know, so often during our 105-year history as a state, and even before then as a territory, Montanans have felt themselves to be the victims of luck, of fate, weather, decisions made in faraway places, and yes, of course, victims of change. But I believe very strongly that we modern-day Montanans can become the masters of our future, the masters of change. We can assume control of our destiny, but it's going to take some changes in the way we think and act, in some of our values, and even in the way we approach change. Let me elaborate. When I grew up in Libby, over on Larch Street, people had front porches where they sat on nice evenings as the sun sank over the Cabinet Mountains. And they talked to each other, and they watched the goings-on along the street, and they called out to their neighbors. You didn't carry on too loudly in your own yard, because your activity ought not to spill over into your neighbor's yard or life, because that would be thoughtless, or worse, downright rude. There's an old-fashioned kind of word you don't hear much anymore. Nothing seems to be rude in this day and age. In life back then, there was a kind of unwritten, unspoken, but clearly understood social compact among everyone. It did not revolve around greed or self-interest. We seemed more together in life then, and the dominant word was ours, not mine. Now, of course, there are no more front porches. There are only large decks in the backyard, where families have planted shrubs and trees and even fences to isolate themselves from others. On the street, we've got stereo headsets to provide personal isolation. We've got security peepholes in the front door. We've got instruments on our phones that secretly reveal the number of the caller. And people act genuinely surprised when they discover the governor's home phone in Montana is listed in the book just like everyone else's. Now, what has all of this got to do with forestry? Well, I guess in a stubborn, individualistic Montana kind of way, I tend to cling to some of what I see as the more civilized, small-town ways of yesteryear. That is the style of operation we are trying to bring back into our state government. And that, quite frankly, is the style of operation I'm suggesting here today that we all bring back to our woods. I imagine we've all heard about the New Deal government and the Fair Deal, and some have called administrations in Washington the Raw Deal. But I suggest something for Montana perhaps called the New Partnership. I believe new partnerships can help greatly, whether they deal with apportioning our state's limited fiscal resources against its unlimited needs, or working to save the bull trout, or to protect our state's fresh waters, or to guard against thoughtless urban sprawl, or to dismantle the political gridlock that used to paralyze our legislature, or dare I say it, to maintain and develop the forests that are so much more than a mere resource to all of us. Our forests are a part of our identity, our very being. They shape the way we live, the way we work, the way we relax, the way we think about the world and about ourselves. The forests even cleanse the air we breathe. They are as much a part of our mental and social environment as we are an integral part of the entire ecosystem. I'm not surprised that the feelings of so many run so high when it comes to our forests. Even an urban New York congresswoman can walk into our woods and feel their strength. But we had all better build a new partnership about those woods, or else I fear we're going to lose some of those special intangibles and an essential part of our identity. We must restore that powerful sense of neighborhood cooperation, that vital kind of social synergy, that kind of unwritten partnership prompted, as you know, even forced neighbors in the old days to get along because they had to. They knew that they were all at risk. They knew how unlivable the neighborhood would quickly become if every disagreement, every late night noise, every mischievous boy or dog was allowed to escalate into a full-blown social skirmish. It's always interested me how lasting are the lessons learned from grandfathers. They often seem to reek of wisdom. I remember my grandfather showing us that one of the dominant characteristics of forest life is its tolerance of, indeed, its desperate need for, diversity. The forests are so full of so many different kinds of life, which includes humankind. Each rich forest element is inextricably linked to all the others through food chains, environmental chains, economic chains, and social chains. And all this runs like a slow-moving river in a never-ending series of century cycles of unwritten cooperation so long and so large that the human mind has trouble grasping their gargantuan scale. But what we do need to grasp, and grasp rather quickly in our eagerness to protect our own zone and score our own points, is that to remove any single element in this complex ecosystem is to throw the entire ecosystem out of balance. Another dominant characteristic of Montana's forest, as you know, is its checkerboard pattern of diverse ownership. A lot of different neighbors, public and private, corporate and individual, large and small, side by side. Each owns a piece of our forest heritage. Each of them, each of us, in effect, is a temporary steward for that temporary section of forest. Each of us, like the neighbors in so many neighborhoods of yesteryear, are linked to each other through a sometimes overlooked common interest, as well as through an obvious physical proximity. I'm here today to suggest that just as we in this administration have tried to forge and maintain productive new partnerships when it comes to budgets and welfare reforms and economic growth, we in Montana need to forge and maintain productive new partnerships when it comes to managing and protecting our forests. And those new partnerships must be aimed not only at producing a forest culture and an economy for today, but leaving it, as you know, alive, vital, and flourishing for succeeding generations. It may seem like an awful lot to expect any kind of social unanimity about a particular subject in the United States of the 1990s. But I would suggest here today that it risks an awful lot more, not to work as hard as possible for that goal. Because if several people are in a leaking boat, it really doesn't matter which partner does not help bail. If everyone doesn't get in rhythm bailing together, then they're all going to sink together. Now, there are some promising signs of new partnerships, of innovative strategies. One outstanding example is the Bear Tree Challenge on the Rocky Mountain front. I would challenge the wood products industry, environmental groups, and the Forest Service to develop a Bear Tree Challenge or a prototype project like it on each forest within grizzly bear habitat. Equally impressive is the continuing innovation and commitment to responsible forest management spearheaded by the logging and lumbering industries. Through a marriage with extension forestry and subsequent educational efforts, tremendous improvement has occurred in on-the-ground forest practices all across every land ownership pattern. Following the adoption of best management practices, a nationally recognized BMP booklet was developed and scores of workshops held. Now on the horizon is the Logger Accreditation Program, empowering loggers with forest management knowledge leading to improved resource protection while accommodating sound, sustainable timber harvest. This is an important next step. With the shift in timber harvest to the non-industrial private forest lands, plus the efforts of the Montana Forest Stewardship Program, there is no excuse now for any logger or landowner to be uninformed about proper forest stewardship. And I would challenge the Montana Logging Association and Extension Forestry to continue to advance the Loggers Accreditation Program. Another example of new partnership is the Bull Trout Restoration Plan. There, state, federal, and private managers of water, land, and wildlife, together with conservation organizations and other members of the public, are working to build individual watershed by individual watershed a plan to restore viable populations of bull trout in western Montana. It's this kind of effort that can help rebuild trust and confidence in government and business. See, I think the American people are tired of endless talkers and political posturers. I think this country perhaps, but surely this state, is ready for some doers, people who bring their professionalism and expertise to a challenge, to join in productive partnerships to provide progress together. Much more progress together than any one party could ever achieve individually. One partnership effort is to drive and to develop and to promote sustainable communities. Another new partnership is the Montana Consensus Council, administered through the Governor's Office and designed to promote new partnerships to resolve natural resource disagreements before they become disputes, which is not only a more amicable process, it saves valuable time and limited money. In short, it lets our society, our business, and yes, even our governments get more done. While some past partnerships, like the Cumulative Watershed Effects Cooperative, have struggled to fulfill their missions, I commend their efforts to refocus. We must coordinate our watershed technical analysis, broaden our information base, and improve our information sharing. Watershed effects and impacts know no land ownership boundaries, as you know, unlike some resource managers. I challenge the Watershed Effects Cooperative members to improve their trust and working relationships with sister landowners, to capture the constantly improving technology, and above all, to communicate their findings, observations, and proposals freely to the land managers. Montana deserves nothing less. The true level of partnership, however, is likely to be tested during the new forest planning process. The previous forest planning process, it is safe to say, was not a rousing success. I'm not assigning blame here. I'm simply making an observation and recognizing the facts. The process did not start out to fail. No one sets out with these kinds of extraordinary efforts to fail. Individually, I suspect everyone involved had the best motives. Individually is the key word. Lacking a true commitment by everyone to a true partnership process, the original forest plans, begun with such high hopes a decade ago, have crumbled. They have contributed mightily to the development of volatile factions within the Forest Service. They've decimated local economies, temporarily, I hope, and worse. We find ourselves, all of us together, with an opportunity to revisit not only forest plans, but forest planning. This is a challenge, certainly, but it is also an opportunity, and what an opportunity it is. I've told Regional Forester Dave Jolly that our administration stands ready to be a full, eager, and conscientious partner in the development of these forest plans. And I'm backing that pledge up today with an invitation to him to sit down together soon to map out not only an effective, efficient, and productive state involvement in forest planning, but one that participates fully in other forest management issues as well. As a temporary steward of the governor's office in Montana, I simply cannot envision a forest management policy that does not include a very close working relationship with the Forest Service. We are interested in solving problems, not managing them. And we are interested in new ways, new partnerships, not old ways and posturings. I strongly believe that this forest planning cycle must involve new partnerships, new, broader, more inclusive ways of looking at the forest as an entire system and not pieces of turf. I want to see a new system of cooperation evolve into new joint management strategies. Ecosystem management and watershed management must be transformed from loosely spent buzzwords into closely held doctrines. And we have to remember that people are a part of the ecosystem too. I realize, of course, that such vast areas and ecosystems do not lend themselves to simplicity or simplification. But here's one simple fact. If we don't start to work together more effectively in planning, using, enjoying, restoring, and protecting our forests, then we are more likely to lose them than not, as we have known them throughout our lives. And think how much poorer our economic, social, and cultural lives and souls would be without the natural majesty of those towering yellow-barked ponderosas, or those Doug firs groaning in a biting February wind, or those golden larches standing there come October. Forget for a moment the enormous economic costs of allowing that treasured resource, that entire ecosystem, to decline and rot through the inability of one element, the human element, to work out a manageable means of cooperation. Frankly, that would not be a life that I would enjoy contemplating. And that would not be an economic or political legacy that I would ever want to be a part of. So for our part, I want to pledge to you here this morning that our administration and every single department within it will continue to do everything in its power to initiate, guide, assist, and promote these kinds of new partnerships. You know where to reach us. Even our home phone is listed. Thank you. I appreciate very sincerely the opportunity to come and talk to such a distinguished group. I, of course, wish all of us good luck as we enter into these new partnership efforts. And I would be delighted, recognizing that I have more than a couple minutes left on my allotted time, to answer any questions that I might be able to respond to that may be on your mind.
With a few definitions. In fact, I'll throw a few of them in here as we move along. I like to go to the dictionary to find definitions of words that are in common English usage, and this is pretty much how the dictionary defines an ecosystem. It's a complex community of organisms that works together with its environment as an integrated unit. Now, one thing that there seems to be a little bit of uncertainty about is whether people are part of ecosystems, and I can assure you that with 5.5 billion people in the world right now, living in just about all the different places, that people certainly are integral parts of most of the Earth's ecosystems. And for those that they're not full-time occupants of, they still have significant influences on what goes on in those ecosystems, if for no other reason than the things that float in from the air periodically. We need to understand that ecosystems, it's both an abstract concept and it's some real things. You can think of ecosystems in a hierarchical sense, from very small places like a stand of trees or a pond to very large places, moving up the scale. The pond or the stand of trees is part of a watershed, which is part of a landscape, which is part of a region, which is part of a continent, and ultimately you get to the whole Earth or the biosphere as the largest of the ecosystems that we tend to think about. Obviously, the smaller places are pretty heavily influenced by the context in which they exist. So the pond can be identified as a distinct entity, but what goes on in the pond is certainly affected in a large sense by the watershed that it is a part of. And you can just extend that argument on up to the whole biosphere. I think it's very useful to think about ecosystems in a personal way as well. There are home places. It's where we live. I happen to live in Missoula, so Missoula Valley is an ecosystem that's my home place. And because I like to recreate in places north and east of here, what we call the crown of the continent ecosystem, or the northern continental divide, that's also part of my home place. And I get a sense of identity from that. A sense of place is very important in this ecosystem concept. These ecosystems are our habitats, and they're the habitats for all other living things. It's where the resources that sustain life come from. It's where we carry out our development, and every other species that has a biological imperative to live, grow, and development does that also. And they're also the places that receive the things that we don't want, our wastes. Ecosystems are home places. They give us a sense of place. I want to take a pretty large perspective on the ecosystem that we call the whole mother, or the Mother Earth, or Earth Mother. One of the species in this ecosystem has been doing very well in its growth and development in the last few hundred years. And if you just think about any species to exist needs to use space and resources to support itself. Well, this species is using a lot more space and resources than it did several hundred years ago. In fact, its growth has been about 90%, 11-fold growth in the last 300 years, from somewhere around the threshold of the Industrial Revolution, say 1600 or 1700 AD, when, according to demographers, folks who estimate populations, that the population of humans on Earth was about 500 million people, and it's now apparently topped 5.5 billion people. So we've had just an exponential growth in 300 years. All right? To support that increase in human population required a lot more of the space and resources of the Earth Mother to go toward human livelihood. And since there are limits to how much of the biosphere was available in the first place, what you can see by dividing a constant size Earth by the growth in the human population is that we get smaller and smaller per capita resources available to people. In fact, there's about 1/9 the amount of Earth per person now than there was 300 years ago. A corollary to that is that there's a lot less space and resources for all the other things that used to live in this place, and the biodiversity loss that you read about so frequently is merely a direct consequence of the fact that the human species is using more and more of the space and resources for its livelihood and has a competitive advantage relative to the other species, and so they're dropping off. I think it's useful to think about the mega factors that are driving the problems that we're trying to confront, whether those problems are economics, communities, environments. Mega factors like the mega trends that John Nesbitt wrote about a few years ago. Population growth is the driving engine for all of these things. And the major challenges that we've got to deal with, poverty and the gap between those who are relatively well off and those who are not, pollution, which is an undesired consequence of the increased human population and its voracious appetite for resources. Profligate consumption, which is drawing more and more of the Earth's net primary productivity towards the human population. Peter Batusek, a biologist at Stanford, estimates that perhaps as much as 40% of the net primary productivity of the biosphere has been appropriated for human use now. I don't know whether those figures are correct or not, but it certainly is gets your attention to think about if that's the right order of magnitude. You know, if it's 20 or if it's 30 or if it's 40, it's still an incredible amount of the basic primary productivity of the Earth ecosystem going toward one species. And political instability. And I hope some of you have encountered an article in the Atlantic Monthly last month by a fellow named Kaplan called The Coming Anarchy. If you hadn't, go get the magazine. Go to the library and make a Xerox copy of it, because he makes a very cogent point that the anarchy that we're seeing in Africa and Serbia, Bosnia now, and other parts of the globe is really a free-for-all for space and resources. It's one of the manifestations of a population that has a wide discrepancy between the haves and the have-nots, and has a social structure that is largely broken down. And his point is that when you get to that situation where people are scrambling for who gets the space and resources, that the line between crime and war blurs, and you no longer know whether this people are trying to defend nation boundaries or whether they're just out there with criminal warlord gangs. It's a tremendous article, and I think for everybody that's thinking about what we need to do with ecosystem management, they ought to read that for the scary end of the spectrum about what might happen if we don't keep our societies healthy. Some of the manifestations of these mega factors. Well, obviously one of them is tremendous use of space and resources and conversion of places from fairly natural things to relatively unnatural things. And of course, Malfunction Junction here in Missoula is only one of the examples. I'd like you to notice the lush riparian vegetation along the Los Angeles River on the lower left-hand corner of that picture. The Los Angeles River, which runs out of the San Gabriel Mountains all the way to the Pacific Ocean for its last 25 or 30 miles, has a concrete riparian zone. Fragmentation of habitats as places are converted from natural areas to human-dominated areas. And there's a lot of discussion about habitat fragmentation, and I got to tell you, there's two kinds. There's the permanent, serious kind that probably will not get reversed, and that's this sort of thing, where a natural area is converted to permanently to an unnatural area. And then there's the temporary, ephemeral kind, which is you put a clear cut in a forest and replant the thing, and over time it grows back up to a forest, or you put some dirt roads through a forest. Those can have some significant impacts on wildlife and are certainly worth worrying about, but they're nothing compared to this sort of thing. Several years ago, these terraces went in. That's the Cleveland National Forest in the background, and it's literally right on the edge of the fence line that the houses that ultimately went in here would be. And this sort of thing goes all the way down the valley, across the river, back up the other side, and on the other side you got exactly the same thing butting up against the Angeles National Forest. And if you take an aerial view of Southern California now, what you've got is some little island mountaintops of natural areas with forest and shrublands and wildlife, and they're just completely enmeshed in a sea of residences and highways and industry. That's the kind of habitat fragmentation that's really of serious concern to the future of wildlife and vegetative health. And then we also have this sort of thing worldwide, just incredible poverty and people living in conditions that are just, they make you cry. They almost make you sick to see this sort of thing. There is a tremendous growth in the discrepancy between the well-off and the not-so-well-off people in society. And as we think about ecosystem management and what we're trying to achieve, we need to pay attention to the equity between the sectors in human society right now. Some of the issues. Now, these issues are pretty relevant to us right here, and I would suggest that just about anywhere you go in North America, and perhaps most places in the world, you're going to run into the specific aspects of these general issues. And I don't mean to imply any particular order here, although I think the ones I've got at the top belong pretty close to the top. Population growth and land use. Well, we sure know that one. Bitterroot Valley, Flathead, Sealy Swan, Clearwater, Blackfoot, Rocky Mountain East Front. I mean, the population growth and land use issues are just all around us. Equity and justice between the different sectors of society. That's this notion I was just mentioning about the difference between the haves and the have-nots. Economic and community viability. Our communities have to be healthy. Our economies have to be diverse and vibrant in order to adjust to change. Lifestyles and cultural diversity. People have to have the things that the Constitution talks about: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Air, water, soil quality are significant concerns, perhaps more so in other parts of the U.S. than they are here, but certainly we've got some big-time issues with the Superfund sites and eutrophication of the Flathead drainage. Agriculture and food, sustainability of agriculture, the healthfulness and quality of food. Forests and wood products, the sustainability of forests for their many values and uses. Minerals and energy, well, we got a big one. It's in the Missoulian this morning. The mine going in over by Lincoln is still a significant concern to people. Recreation and tourism, which is a very important component of our economy based on our natural assets here, but it is by no means a benign industry. It can have just as serious of environmental effects as anything else. Biological diversity, especially focused on endangered species and those that are headed in that direction. You'll hear about some of those today. Grizzly bears, bull trout at least. Government coordination. We've got incredible complexity in government's agencies and responsibilities between local and state and federal levels, and the coordination between them is getting better, but it's very complex, and sometimes agencies fall over one another in trying to carry out their responsibilities. And waste management. These are some of the major issues that have to get addressed in ecosystem management, and I hope you can see right now that this is a lot more than just new forestry. So out of this complexity of issues, this idea of ecosystem management emerges, and I've just tried to put together the dictionary definition for management here and apply it to ecosystems. And you know, this is not the agency definition by any means, but I think it's the use of skillful actions based in scientific knowledge and experience to produce, sustain, restore, whatever you want, desired conditions of environments, economies, and human communities, individual livelihood. To me, that's what ecosystem management means. So it's got a science base, it's got a value base, and it addresses a very broad spectrum of goals. Traditionally, we've tended to think of these three ideas, these three spectrums or spheres of economies and communities and environments as somewhat independent. And we'd have people who drive real hard to try and keep the environment clean, and we'd have people who drive really hard to do economic development, and we have people who drive really hard to keep communities working well. That's the old way of thinking. Ecosystem management says you got to bring those together, and what you've got to do is work where they overlap, where the goals for economies, the goals for environment, the goals for communities have to come together. And that, I think, is the essential difference between our traditional approaches and the ecosystem management approach. And the ecosystem management approach does not mean that we can do away with the disciplinary expertise that we had as sociologists or economists or foresters or biologists or fisheries scientists. In fact, we probably need more disciplinary expertise, but what we need in addition is the ability of those people to work in an integrated or interdisciplinary sense, to try and find solutions that will strike a reasonable balance among the goals that we have for communities, environments, and economies. The notion of sustainable development, I think, is the concept that best brings those together. And of course, you're probably familiar with the Brundtland Commission's definition, which was endorsed at the Rio Summit a couple of years ago. There's a really outstanding paper on sustainable development by one of the Nobel laureates, Robert Solow. And I think his definition is probably the best of all of them. And he says, because we can't predict the future and we don't know exactly what the economies or the social values or the environments are going to be like, what we really need to think about doing is that we're trying to perpetuate the capacity of future generations to be as well off as we are. And that's acknowledging that they're going to probably come up with new technologies, they're going to have different values, they're going to confront different environmental challenges. But what we need to give them is an environment, a culture, an infrastructure of technology and tools and knowledge that together they can use in whatever way they deem fit to try to achieve the kind of standard of living and environmental quality that they would like to achieve. But in any case, sustainable development has an eye toward the future. It's a statement by society that they're making a moral obligation toward that future. And I think it has some really interesting implications in the combination of these two words. Develop means to make available for use or to allow things to unfold gradually. And if you just take development without any qualifying words, you get the notion that it could go on forever, that there's really no limits to development. By putting the word sustainable in there, you're beginning to acknowledge that there are some limits. Sustain means to support, hold up, supply, or withstand. And when you bring any sustainable development into an ecosystem concept, you have to deal with the realities of ecosystems. Remember, ecosystems are the sources of our livelihood. They're the places where development's going to occur. They're the places that receive our waste. They're our home places. They have limits. They have biological and physical limits that can be temporarily overcome by putting energy and resources from one place into another, but they can't be perpetually overcome without running down the other places that you got those resources to transfer from. So they're limited biologically and physically. We need to understand what those capabilities and limits are so that we can work more efficiently and effectively within those. They're very complex in structure and function. As a number of people like to talk about, they're more complex than we can even envision them to be, and that's true. And unfortunately, most of the complexity is not visible to us. It's in the water under the soil, in the soil under the rivers, and it's in the soils itself, and it's on the leaves and in the crevices, and probably a tremendous complexity is the load of parasites and commensals that live in the bodies of every plant and animal. They're very dynamic in space and time. No such thing as a stable, static ecosystem. They're constantly changing. Even on a daily basis, they change, and certainly on a decade to a several decade basis, the changes are quite dramatic. And I just suggest the photo points that many of you have probably seen, where people took a picture in the Black Hills or over on the East Front or down the Bitterroot around the turn of the century, and somebody went back and took another picture of the same place, and you can see just how dynamic even as long-lasting an ecosystem as a forest is. They're open to the flows of energy and nutrients. There's no such thing as a closed ecosystem. There's no such thing as a self-sufficient ecosystem. There's things moving back and forth across whatever boundaries we may wish to draw on a place. And even the biosphere, you take that, the Earth, takes a daily dose of solar radiation to keep running. So even the Earth is not self-sufficient. It needs the sun out there to keep it going. They're interconnected and interdependent, and they're only partially predictable. And I think this last point is very important to understand. We can do a relatively good job of predicting what an ecosystem is going to be like, say, a year from now, if we have a pretty good knowledge of what it is right now. It gets a little weaker when we try to project out a decade. It gets weaker yet when we go out about 50 years. Going out 100 years is really a wild guess. So much changes. The human dimensions are changing. The environmental dimensions are changing. So at best, regardless of how sophisticated our models become, these ecosystems are only partially predictable. These are the characteristics of ecosystems that we need to understand, that we have to work within. And Garrett Hardin, who wrote a marvelous little book called Filters Against Folly, How to Survive Despite Economists, Ecologists, and the Merely Eloquent. highly recommend this book. He's got a couple of really important points, and one he says is that it's true that everything is connected to everything else, and I think he might even remind us that it wasn't John Muir that discovered that probably Aboriginal peoples long ago had discovered it. In fact, if you are familiar at all with the Lakota saying "Mitakuyasin," all my relations, it implies that people have understood that everything was connected to everything else for a much longer period of time than ecologists have figured it out. But he goes on to say, that's really not the most important thing to understand. What's important is to understand the implications of that. And the implication is that you can't do only one thing in an ecosystem, that if you poke it in some place, it pops out in another place. For example, if we reduce the supply of trees from the public lands in the Northwest and we don't do anything to change the consumption of wood in the country, it's going to pop up somewhere else as increased harvest of trees. Might be in eastern Montana, might be in the southeastern part of the United States, but you can't do only one thing. That's the important point about the interconnectedness of ecosystems, and Hardin goes on to say what that means is the most important question you can ask when you're thinking ecologically is, and then what? You figure you get to a conclusion, well, we're going to save the salmon, so we're going to start flushing water down the Columbia so the salmon do better. And then what? Well, there's some other things in those waters that might not benefit from that. So we got to think about the consequences of the actions that we come up with. And then what? Where, when, why? That's what ecological thinking is. Now, I want to just say a few things about forests to put them in a context, because obviously this is the focus of this conference, and frankly, forests are one of the Earth's most important ecosystems, right up there with wetlands and estuaries, oceans. Worldwide, forests are under an incredible assault. And it goes back to this growth in the human population. About 31% of the land surface of the world is covered by forests. That's at least 25% less than there was 300 years ago, and it may be as much as 40 or 50%, depending on whose statistics you want to use. Brazil is very heavily forested, but under tremendous pressure to convert forest to agriculture. The Soviet Union, and you can see I made this slide a few years ago. Russia, about 42% forested, and is considered to be the great untapped Russian timber mine. Under great pressure right now for exploitation. Europe has about half the forest that it once had, suffering very heavily from pollution and the results of very intensive single species management for about 200 years now. In the U.S., we're in relatively good shape. Almost a third of the land area is forested, and contrary to what many people are arguing, they're actually increasing in their productivity and wood yields. India is fighting a losing battle. Once 60% forested, it's now 20% forested. There's 60 million hectares of forest in India, and there's 50 million people living in them, with 90 million head of livestock grazing in the forest. Just an unbelievable pressure on the forest in India. China, I don't know what they started out with, but they're down around 10 or 12% right now, and it's virtually all gone from the eastern part of China where the highest density of people are. That's the world forest situation. If you look at the change over time, you can see from 1700 to 1980, the original forested area down to where we are right now, about 15 billion acres to 10. And I'm sorry, I'm converting from hectares to acres here. I know they're a little confusing. In the U.S., from about 1 billion down to 700 million over the same period of time. But look at these bars when you put them on a per capita basis. You can hardly see the little red bar down there at the end. Worldwide, there's less than 1 acre of forest per human being now, where there once was about 25. In what is now the United States, where there was once about 110 or 115 acres per human being, using an estimate of about 10 million Aboriginal people before Europeans arrived, we're down to just a little under 3 right now. And this is a classic definition of a scarce resource, and we all know how valuable this resource is, so it should be little wonder why the competition and the controversy are going on about who gets to do what with forests. The use of wood. in the forests of the world continues to go up. Industrial roundwood, which is all the wood that isn't used for fuel in some way, has increased steadily at about 2% a year for the last 4 decades. 1/3 of that total is consumed by people who live in the United States. Human population of the United States is 5% of the world population, and it uses 33% of the industrial roundwood. The use of fuel wood in the developing parts of the world is almost equal or maybe a little more than this. So you can double this as the pressure of human beings on forest for taking wood out of the forest for various uses. In the United States, our use of wood collectively has gone up by about 20% in the last 15 years, largely driven by increased use of wood in home construction and cogeneration, home heating and generation of electricity in the wood products industry. One would look at those and think, my God, the forests of the United States must be in terrible shape. Well, they're not. Relatively, the area that's forested has remained fairly static. It is dropping just slightly now as residential and agricultural conversions still cut into it a little bit. But we've been relatively stable, and the reason for that is that agricultural technology over the last 70 years has allowed us to meet our food needs without converting more of the forest into farms. And the amount of wood biomass that's accumulating in the forest for the last 4 decades has exceeded the removals. We're actually stockpiling wood in our forests. Now, this is not true in every region. Some regions are doing better than others, and one consequence of the reduced supply in the Northwest is that in the Southeast, for the first time in a decade, trees are being harvested faster than they're growing. But most of the rest of the country, wood is stockpiling in the forest. Now, I'm not going to argue that that's a good thing. I'm not convinced that stockpiling old wood in the lodgepole pine forest is a good ecological and environmental thing to have done. And I'm pretty sure that stockpiling wood in the pinyon juniper forests of the Southwest, where it causes the elimination of the grass understory and the consequent erosion of the A horizon of the soil, is a good thing, but nevertheless, these are the statistics. What's evolving is a much clearer understanding of something that foresters, I think, have known for quite some time, that forest stewardship really operates along 3 major themes. And each of these themes is equally important. It's not a matter of one being environmentally superior to the others or economically superior. They're all valuable for the things that they do. There's a native forest theme, there's a production forest theme, and then there's some kind of an intermediate, which you can call multi-benefit or multi-value or multi-use. And we need all of these. The native forest theme obviously is important for places that need to be protected for their natural characteristics or for unique values. You're going to find them in parks and wilderness areas, nature reserves. The passive values of these areas are going to dominate over the active uses. The emphasis is going to be for prescriptions that restore and sustain natural ecological processes such as fire, the natural recovery after storms. The diversity is going to be quite variable. They're not necessarily going to be full of all of the potential diversity. They're going to probably emphasize the diversity of plant and animals that are associated with older age biological conditions. Net productivity is likely to be low. In fact, it could even be, in general, a wash. That the respiration that goes on in those forests is probably going to be about equal to the photosynthetic capture of energy. Tend to be dominated by older stages. These native forests right now comprise 10, 15, 20% of the forested area of the country. They're not all in wilderness areas and national parks either. The intermediate multi-benefit forest is extremely important because of the variety of values and uses that we need to obtain from them. They're involved in wood production, but wood production is not the dominant value. They provide wildlife benefits, they provide recreational benefits, aesthetic benefits. This is an example of a young forest growing in a national forest in California. You're going to have these mostly on federal and state lands, but some private lands are going to play significant roles in this, and I can just mention a few industrial lands. I think the environmental forestry program that Plum Creek is embarking on is going to give us much more of a multi-benefit forest than the old wood production emphasis. Pacific Lumber out in California, Sierra Pacific Industries, Anderson Tully in the south, Westvaco, these are all corporations that are shifting their forest operations into more of a multi-benefit type forest. So it's not all going to be on public land. It's multiple values and multiple uses. There's going to be a variety of prescriptions, probably emphasizing multiple age classes. It's quite variable and probably pretty high stand and landscape diversity in these kind of forests. Net productivity moderate, and they're going to have a mix of stages and patterns. And then last, we're going to have the production forests. You're looking at 3 generations of trees in 100 years here. Obviously, those old cedar stumps were the original trees that were harvested around the turn of the century. This is out on the Olympic Peninsula, and they truly were a magnificent old growth stand. In there, underneath the ferns, there's some stumps of 24-inch trees that grew between the time the cedars were harvested and about 5 to 10 years ago. And then you can see the little spruce and hemlock poking their heads up. This is the start of the third generation of trees on this one site, a tremendously productive site providing just a phenomenal wood fiber growth and production. So we're going to have mostly private and some state and federal. There's at least 7 million acres, for example, in the National Forest System that probably biologically, economically, ecologically could go into this kind of land use. They're going to emphasize the efficient production of wood, which is needed for various uses in our society. They're going to be predominantly even-age prescriptions, though they won't necessarily all be clear cuts. Diversity is probably going to be relatively low, and it'll emphasize the kinds of plants and animals that are associated with disturbed sites and young stages. Very high net productivity. That's really the purpose of it, is to get productivity pumped up as high as possible. And they're going to be younger age forests. And I would argue that ecosystem management in our society needs to have all 3 of these phases of forestry in practice where they make the best sense. And they're going to have to be used over a very large landscape, not just on the small wedges in the upper right-hand corner that constitute the federal lands. We're going to have to employ the whole wildland landscape in using each of these approaches. Now, obviously, the wood production approach is probably going to be more prevalent on that blue part than on the colored wedges up at the top, and the native forest is probably going to be predominantly in the colored wedges at the top. And I'm not arguing that we need government to figure this out. I think the community decision-making and the economic markets will be very helpful to us in figuring out where these things ought to be. But ecosystem management, to provide all of the benefits of forests, for example, is going to need to be perceived as operating over the whole forested landscape, and people acknowledging that the tree farms that are one of the reasons why wood production is so high in this country, the 90 million acres of tree farms, are every bit as important to successful ecosystem management and biodiversity conservation as the wilderness areas and the old growth preserves are, because they play different, complementary, and very important functions. I've heard some people suggest, well, maybe we shouldn't use wood, let's use alternatives to wood, and I want to tell you there's some serious environmental impacts of using things to substitute for wood, whether it's concrete or plastics or steel or aluminum. These things have their own environmental impacts. Among them, they take about 3 to 10 times the fossil fuel energy to produce an equivalent structural unit. It's been estimated by Peter Koch, who lives down the road here in Corvallis, that substituting for 1 billion board feet of wood, concrete, plastics, aluminum, etc., could pump 7.5 million tons of CO2 into the environment that wouldn't otherwise go there, because it would use 720 million barrels of oil to generate those products that would not have been used if wood had been the product of use. So there are significant environmental consequences of substituting things for wood. In fact, wood happens to be one of the most environmentally superior natural resources that we have. I want to start pulling this together a little bit. A strategy for sustainability. that sustainability is what we're trying to achieve, knowing that it's an elusive target, it's not precisely definable. Ecosystem management is a process we're going to use to get there. We have to integrate a lot of pieces that haven't historically been very well integrated. Meeting basic human needs for subsistence is fundamental, because without that, nothing else is going to be possible. And any of you have been to a part of the world where people are not having their basic needs met, you realize that ethics comes after breakfast. That's fundamental. Sustaining the economic vitality of our local and regional and national economies is essential. That's where the development part comes in. Trying to rely more and more on individual and community responsibility for taking the right actions so that we don't have to rely on government to always figure things out. Property rights are going to be an increasingly important tool in being able to rely upon individuals and communities to be the responsible actors. Broadening the economic incentives so that there's a more equitable array of incentives to induce people to do the things that we would like them to do to take care of environments and economies, etc. And the use of markets. Free market environmentalism that the people down in Bozeman are working on is an important tool in this. We're going to have to come up with some vital signs. We need to know if we're trying to manage these ecosystems for some set of conditions, how are we going to measure, what are we going to measure to tell us whether we're on the right track? Science is going to be a very important tool in decision making, but we need to understand that science is not a religion, despite what some people think. We shouldn't be relying upon science to give us our value judgments. We should be able to use science to tell us what's possible and what the likely consequences of our choices are. Science is a service, not a divine oracle. Collaboration and cooperation are going to have to be emphasized in addition to our natural tendencies to be competitive. We're not going to do away with the competitive nature of people. It's a biological characteristic in all organisms. It's what allows them to survive. But when you're cramming more and more people into a fixed amount of space, they're going to have to work out some commensal relationships that are a little bit more healthy and conducive to sharing that space than competition all the time. And we're going to have to return to a conservation ethic that I know was prevalent in this society a couple of generations ago. I can remember my grandmother keeping a ball of string, and I can remember my mom folding aluminum foil until it literally wore out. And those are things that we just don't do anymore. We've got to get back to a conservation ethic in the use and the extending the life of natural resources and raw materials. Now let's talk about participatory decision making, because this is a real important part of ecosystem management. The people want to have a say in the action. So we see a lot of moves toward opening up the decision process. Community building, getting decision making back to what Lincoln talked about in the second inaugural address. Government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And you've seen projects going on all over the region about this. Stevensville happens to be just one of them. An open dialogue for the purpose of finding the common ground, seeking a common vision, focused on people collectively trying to figure out the desired future conditions that they want to achieve. It also means that community of interest has to take the accountability and the responsibility and not just keep pushing it off onto somebody else, such as government. And government shifting from the role as being the expert, the decision maker, to being a service that serves this community of interest, trying to make the decisions on what it wants to do for its economies, environments, and its own communities of people. The desired future condition is a very important concept. It's a description of where we'd like to be. And I would suggest that we need to think broadly about this, and that these desired future conditions need to address us right in our home places, our personal, family, and neighborhoods, our communities, societies, as well as our economies and in our environment. The desired future conditions are not just statements of what the hillside ought to look like when we're through harvesting trees. How we're going to get there is called adaptive management. That's another concept that's been around for a long time and is increasingly being employed and tested out. We've got to know something about what conditions and assets are that we have to work with. That comes from inventories and classifications. We need to be able to assess options and capabilities. That comes from ecological models and predictive tools. We need to be able to evaluate trade-offs. That's where we get into valuation and economics and non-economic ways of assessing pros and cons. We need to have plans, whether it's a community land use plan, such as is going on in Flathead, or a national forest plan, or some kind of a regional strategy that tells us how we're going to get there. We need to take actions. The job isn't through until you actually put things on the ground. We've got to be able to measure the responses and come back and evaluate whether we need to change the course, and just keep repeating that over and over. That's what adaptive management is. I think you all intuitively have known it for years and years. But there's a few weak spots. Our inventories aren't as good as we'd want. Some of our predictive tools are not too good. Our ability to monitor and make evaluations based on what we read is probably the weakest of all. These vital signs that people talk about have to address individuals and families, communities, economies, the biological and physical parts of the environment, how we hold people responsible, and our efficiency in using resources. This is a real open area of development right now. I think people are just beginning to scratch the surface on how to come up with vital signs for ecosystem management. I mentioned conservation. We've got to balance supply and demand. So far, all the policies I've seen on what to do about timber harvest in the national forests are failing to balance supply and demand, because they do not include anything to address the consumption of wood, and there's no balance. We're constricting supply, and we're letting the demand keep going, and all that does is put the pressure on somebody else. So conservation means getting a better handle on balancing supply and demand. We've got to produce wealth. At the same time, we have to reduce consumption, learn how to reuse materials, recycle, etc. Some principles to hold in mind. The human species is the key species. It is the keystone species in ecosystem management, because it all starts with people. Land health is key to sustainability. Land must be productive, resilient, diverse. Bill Banzaf will talk about that a little later in this meeting. Science has to tell us what's possible, not what to do. Collaboration is a key to consent, and in a contentious society, we're going to need more collaboration. And adaptation, as it's always been through evolutionary history, is the key to survival. We must be able to change, to take on new ideas, to respond to new forces. There's some big impediments out there. These could derail us. There's a lot of missing information. Property rights are unclear, in some cases leading us to the tragedy of the commons, where nobody suffers too much from using one more piece of the common resource. Coordination among public and private sector entities is weak. Incentives right now are biased toward the short term and those that return immediate financial profit. Government is getting more central, despite the rhetoric out of Washington, D.C. I think we're seeing more centralization of decision making rather than less, and I think that's a real impediment to ecosystem management. Our society is extremely polarized, very disappointingly so, and of course it's worse out in the Northwest, where they've literally torn their communities apart for at least a generation, maybe 2 generations, something that we ought to try to avoid at all costs. And regulations are getting so complicated that we may be in a situation where it's not possible anymore to do a legally defensive plan on anything, because it's so complex and overwhelming. For those of you that have been in the business of forestry and wildlife for a long time, I want to leave you with a thought that this ecosystem management stuff is not an attempt to throw out all the good stuff you've done over the years and that your predecessors did. I think what we're looking at is a progression, an evolution that started a long time ago, 100 years ago, with reservation of lands for various values, the protection of resources, the regulation of overuse, the evolution of sustained yield management, and then it's broadening into multiple use, and then adding some special things like wilderness preservation, environmental assessments, endangered species, and in the 70s and 80s what we saw is integrated resource planning and management. I think ecosystem management is another step in this evolution, and consequently it builds upon and uses the valid things that were learned in the past. And I want to give you a familiar concept, the old fire triangle, that the flame goes out if you take the heat or the oxygen or the fuel away. If we think about ecosystem management and the sustainability of ecosystems as that flame, the 3 sides are economy, ecology, or environment, and community. If we don't balance those three sides in some way, we're not going to be able to sustain desired conditions in ecosystems. It's that simple. Another way to look at that is that our decisions have got to be ecologically sound, economically feasible, and politically and socially desirable. And that's the only way we're going to achieve some kind of a reasonable harmony between human beings and land and resources. And it is that elusive harmony that Aldo Leopold talked about when he defined conservation that we're seeking. It's not a matter of figuring out whether Earth comes first or people come first. That's ridiculous. We've got to find a way for people to live in a better relationship with land and resources in a way that sustains our economic vitality, the health of our communities, our individual livelihood, provides some equity between the current sectors of society and with the next generations, and does that through maintaining healthy, diverse, productive natural environments. That's the overview, and we're probably either out of time or real close. Somebody turn the lights on, and if there's any time, we'll handle questions.